I actually think that hard work and attitude are more important than intelligence. The ones who move on most successfully are the ones who ask questions. Ideas are cheap. I have more ideas every morning while I'm drinking my coffee than I could ever get to in my career.
Welcome to Unplugged, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast where we strip away the fluff and get real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. I've been wondering what happens when you sit down with one of the industry's most accomplished minds, reflecting on decades of discovery from things like sequencing the chicken genome to mentoring future scientific leaders, and what can we learn from someone with a wealth of scientific and leadership experience about what it takes to be a great researcher in the poultry sciences? That's what we're going to tackle in this week's episode. We sit down with a friend and mentor of mine, Dr. Tom Porter, one of the world's renowned endocrinologists, educators, a fellow of the Poultry Science Association, and our past president, as well as former editor-in-chief of our flagship journal, Poultry Science, and current editor-in-chief of the journal World's Poultry Science. We're going to talk about some of the breakthroughs in his research, the molecular mechanics behind broiler growth, and then the power of mentorship in the lab. I'm really looking forward to this conversation as Dr. Porter shares insights from the lab, the classroom, and the editor's desk as he's helped shape the future of poultry science around the world during his career. If you are not familiar with Dr. Porter's CV, I would encourage you to go read it because it's really an incredible study. He did his work at the University of Minnesota as a proud Minnesotan. I had the chance to go to Charleston with Tom to visit his old stomping grounds in Charleston at the Medical University of South Carolina. Served on faculty at Texas A&M University for a number of years prior to his lengthy service at the University of Maryland. Dr. Porter, as I've alluded to here, it would be hard for me to think of somebody who has given of themselves more generously to PSA or to the broader poultry science community. But I want to start with the science before we get into your leadership expertise. You've led major research in this field of endocrinology. What are you working on now? What's the most exciting discovery you and your collaborators in your lab have made recently? What's got you getting out of the bed, ready to go every morning?
Yeah, so you mentioned hormonal regulation of growth in broilers. That's a project that, we started that in 1993. We're still working on it, quite frankly. And some of the hormones that control growth are produced by the pituitary gland. And the pituitary produces a number of hormones, including adrenocorticotropic hormone, the gonadotropic hormones, thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, and growth hormone, the hormone that we've studied the most. And during embryonic development, the cells that produce these hormones differentiate in a specific order. The cells that regulate stress responses and produce adrenocorticotropic hormone differentiate first. The cells that produce growth hormone and regulate growth differentiate later on. And if you look through the literature, the dogma is that these are down different lineages or different pathways. And in the past year and a half or so, my lab conducted some research using a really state-of-the-art technique called single-cell RNA sequencing. We did that in pituitary glands of chicken embryos. And what we found was that there was co-expression of adrenocorticotropic hormone and growth hormone under certain conditions at certain ages. And that just really, it goes against all dogma, all textbook, all current reviews on the subject. So if you want to get, an old distinguished professor excited about research, then you need to just break the dogma. And that's what one of my PhD students did. That's probably the most exciting thing out of my area of research lately, is that everything we thought of about these lineages of cell types that control everything in the body might be wrong, and we might have to rethink that again.
This is one of the things I love about working for a group of scientists, because it's helped me. As kids, you go through your elementary school science class, we all learn the scientific method, and I think you think of it in a very rigid sort of way. And then you come to work for a group of scientists and you learn, that process of discovery that you've described, it never ends. If you think this is the quote unquote correct answer, wait 20, 30 years, maybe the technology gets better to let you do some processes. How do you approach something like that? As you say, that you don't become the crusty old distinguished professor when the young PhD says, Tom, I've been thinking, what's that conversation like?
We didn't design that experiment looking for co-expression of those two hormones. We designed that experiment looking for something else, trying to identify specific transcription factors in each cell type. And, he first presented that research to me. I said, Kevin, do you know what you're looking at? I mean, this is amazing. We didn't set out to look for that, and we discovered it somewhat serendipitously. And that makes it even more exciting, I think.
Well, and you started off talking about your work in endocrinology and the key structures in the brain of the chicken that make all this magic work. But I had the chance to visit your lab earlier this spring, and you also were sharing with us that you're now working on some studies in heat stress in broilers. Kind of timely as we get ready to go into summer months here. What got you into that as sort of an offshoot of your normal work, and what kind of breakthroughs or discoveries or questions are you seeing or asking in that part of your research program?
So it's interesting. And most people would call me a basic scientist. And certainly if I'm looking at cell differentiation in the pituitary gland, that was very basic, right? Fundamental science. I had gotten to a point in my career where I really wanted to work in an area where I could do something that would be directly applicable to the poultry industry. And that was really how I went down the road of looking at heat stress. And around the world, millions of birds die a year from heat stress, and it's not intentional, right? These power outages, et cetera, things happen.
Right.
Wanting to do something that was relevant, immediately relevant, rather than just for the next version of a textbook. That's how we started out on heat stress. And I combined that with our expertise, if you will, on the endocrine system. So really, we're looking more at the effects of heat stress on hormones, hormone production, that type of thing. And then we've combined that with management approaches that can be used to mitigate heat stress. And we're trying to understand how they work. How do they function? How do they help mitigate it? And one that has been used, many different laboratories have used this around the world for a couple of decades now, is to do what we call early life thermal conditioning. Basically, you condition the birds to high temperatures when they're young. It doesn't hurt them. It really doesn't cause them that much stress when they're young, but it helps them to thrive later on under heat stress conditions. A number of different labs have documented that, but nobody knows how it works. And that's really what we've been looking at, is how is it that this early life exposure to high temperatures allows the birds to not only survive heat stress, but actually continue to thrive during that period.
I love that connection between all of this fundamental science you've been doing for decades to that desire to, as you say, do something practical, so to speak, as though what you were doing that was really important work wasn't, useful. Obviously, you've contributed a ton to the industry through your work. But one of the things I'm curious about is you interact with your fellow scientists, whether it's at a PSA meeting, whether it's at one of the many other, you belong to other scientific societies as well in your specializations. What do you find the relationship is like between those of you who focus on fundamental basic science versus maybe a more applied research program? Is there a gap or a gulf there? Do y'all speak different languages when you get together? And as you go to, say, one of our scientific conferences, for example, and you're listening to more applied presentations, how does that influence what you're doing in the lab and vice versa?
I think there is I don't know if it's a gap between the two groups, but it's maybe a lack of understanding completely of one group is doing versus another one is doing. I enjoy the fact that I straddle that, at least to some extent. There's no doubt that I'm more of a basic scientist than an applied scientist. Absolutely no doubt about that. But I appreciate applied research. I appreciate how it can benefit the industry, the growers, the integrators, and ultimately the public. I appreciate that. I think not everyone on the basic science side appreciates that. And I think on the applied side, I don't think that everyone appreciates basic science and how it informs future applied research, how it informs just our understanding of the birds, how they operate.
I'm going out on a limb and guessing that your unique perspective on that, the way you were just describing it, probably has been shaped to some extent by your extensive work as a journal editor, because you're reading a lot of research beyond, your own field of specialization. And I tend to find that when I've interacted with our past EICs or section editors, you have a broader perspective, I think, because of your just being inundated with a tremendous amount of scholarship during your term as EIC. Are there lessons from that you would share with, listeners here, young scientists, young faculty members, young industry researchers, about how they can maybe gain some appreciation for one shop or the other? Hey, if I'm listening to this and I'm at a company working in R&D and I'm a very applied scientist in that space, or I'm an extension professional and so on, how can I maybe gain some of that broader perspective you've just described so well?
I think you're absolutely right. When I first became editor-in-chief of Poultry Science, really, my whole perspective opened up. I was trained as a physiologist. Really, I'm an endocrinologist, and if you want to look at it, I'm a molecular and cellular endocrinologist who does genomics. But now I'm handling manuscripts across the board coming in from everywhere. I would never give the impression that I'm qualified to review all of those manuscripts, but I would read the reviews, read the section editor's opinions, think about it from that way, think about the journal as a whole and what kind of papers we should be publishing. So without a doubt, it opened up my mind in terms of the breadth of poultry science and poultry research. The other thing I would add to that is I was chair of our department for 2 terms, and not everyone in our department is a basic scientist. I had to learn to appreciate the work that was done by applied researchers, extension specialists in our department, and so forth. So I think those 2 roles really gave me a broad appreciation for both aspects of science. For somebody young coming in, I'll tell you one thing that I do. For example, at our annual meetings of the Poultry Science Association, I take advantage of the symposia that are not in my area. It's like continuing education, right? I can walk in a symposium on muscle myopathies. It's an area that I don't work in,
Right.
but in a few hours, I can be brought up to speed on muscle myopathies in every aspect, from the incidence of it, if you will, and the processing plants, to current research on the molecular basis for muscle myopathy. So I take advantage of those opportunities, and I would encourage any young scientist to do the same thing. Certainly you could volunteer to review papers. That would be great. But generally, we ask people to review papers in their area of expertise, right? So you're not going to get that breadth. So I guess my advice would be to take advantage of the annual meetings or other conferences and get outside of your box, get outside of your comfort zone, and try to gain at least a perspective on other aspects of it.
Earlier this year, we interviewed Paul Siegel for this podcast, another fellow alum of the Poultry Science Editor-in-Chief's office. And he shared something really similar. When I asked him why he wanted to become editor-in-chief, he posed it as like he was being a greedy so-and-so because he wanted to get access to all of this research first and know what people were working on and doing, and to have that broad perspective. The moral of the story is you want to be more informed, read more, right? That sort of thing. So I want to get in the Wayback Machine for a minute, go back to your early days as a junior faculty member. As I mentioned, you came out of a postdoc at the Medical University of South Carolina. It wasn't necessarily a given at that stage that you were going to be involved in the animal sciences. What inspired you to want to build the Porter Lab that we know today? And how did that happen?
My bachelor's degree was in biology. And back then, 1983, undergraduate students didn't do a lot of research in laboratories. I got my degree and I went out and I looked for a job. And the first job I got was as a lab technician, entry-level lab technician. And I just fell in love with benchtop research. I said, this is amazing. I was extracting RNA and doing northern blots and these things. I absolutely loved it. I had never had that experience before. So I decided to go to graduate school. And one thing to get admitted into a program, it's another to find a laboratory that will accept you. So I will be forever grateful to Professor Muhammad El-Halawani at the University of Minnesota, who accepted me into his group. Muhammad El-Halawani had just an absolute childlike enthusiasm for research. If you're running an experiment, he would be in the lab looking over your shoulder, how did it go? How did it go? Did it work? Did it work? It was infectious. He infected me with that enthusiasm. By the time I finished with my PhD, I knew I wanted to stay in academics. I wanted to run my own lab. I accepted the postdoc position that you mentioned in Charleston, mainly because it was a kind of a state-of-the-art cellular endocrinology lab at the time. I learned a lot in that lab from Steve Frawley, my postdoc mentor. At that point, I was working with rats, right? Not poultry. Or Muhammad El-Halawani worked with turkeys. So I went from working with turkeys to working with rats and thought, what, maybe I'll apply for positions in medical schools. I wasn't offered a position, but Texas A&M, the poultry science department at Texas A&M, offered me a job as an assistant professor, gave me a laboratory. I had no roadmap to get where I ended up.
I've had some conversations even this week with other faculty members at different stages of their career, some junior faculty members, some more senior faculty members. One of the secret ingredients of being successful in academia is that flexibility, I guess maybe would be the way to look at it, that you adapted to, hey, I didn't have a grand plan here, but here was an opportunity at A&M and I took advantage of it, and kind of the story writes itself from there. Am I looking at survivorship bias, or is there just something inherent in the machine? Because I sat around with your colleagues when we visited your lab, and I had 6 or 7 other Maryland poultry scientists. Almost every one of them had a similar story to yours where, well, I was in the medical field, or I was at this, or I was at that, and I was working with rats, or I was working with mice, and I wasn't necessarily intending to work with chickens, but poof, here I am. So I'm curious about your perspective on the role that just being willing to roll with the punches plays in becoming a successful researcher and scientist.
I think there's a big part of that. And I would even extend that to grants. Most of my research funding has come from federal grants. Well, you might have a pet project. You might have what you think is a great idea. You write a grant proposal on it. Maybe that panel doesn't think it's a great idea, or maybe they don't see a need for it.
Mm-hmm.
You might try one more time, but if that project is not going to get funded, you move on to something else. And I have done that. I have had projects that just ended. Maybe we finished them, or maybe we couldn't get enough money to do what I wanted to do. So I think the idea of being flexible is an important one. I think the worst thing you can do is to walk in and say, I am going to do this, and that is what I'm going to do and nothing else. You might not be able to get the money to do it. You might not be able to identify students or others who are interested in working with you. I think you have to be flexible.
You were talking about the development of your lab earlier and getting started. I know the lab today supports students from undergraduates on through postdocs. What qualities are you looking for? You had a great mentor, both in your PhD program and your postdoc. What are you looking for, and what qualities do you prioritize when you're building your lab team and who you welcome into the Porter organization?
The first thing is a genuine interest in the work that we're doing. If I'm looking to hire or take on a graduate student, they're going to be in my lab for, somewhere between 2 years, 4 years, in some cases 6 years, or maybe even a little longer, depending on the nature of the project and how many degrees they get. So they have to be interested in. I don't have any interest myself in being the cheerleader to get somebody interested in my research. They need to come in, they need to be interested in what we're doing, the questions that we're trying to answer. So that's the first aspect of it. It would be great if they're enthusiastic. They don't have to be as enthusiastic as I am, but if they're enthusiastic, that's a great part of it. I actually think that hard work and attitude are more important than intelligence. Ideas are cheap. I have more ideas every morning while I'm drinking my coffee than I could ever get to in my career. It's really the attitude, but also a lab citizen attitude too. They've got to be able to get along with everyone. Those are the traits. As long as they get B's in chemistry, that's where I stop in terms of academic thing. I don't care. I don't need a 4.0 student. I don't need somebody with an IQ greater than mine. Somebody who's willing to work hard with a good attitude.
And I think that's an important distinction, if for students maybe, or younger faculty members who are listening to this, who are going to be developing there. I think a lot of us from the outside would assume, oh, we want to surround ourselves with the smartest people. I need brilliance. But I had another mentor, and I make no secret about the fact that I consider you a mentor of mine, even though I'm not a poultry scientist. But another mentor of mine said that there's going to be kids who are smarter, there's going to be kids that are faster, there's going to be kids who are prettier. You can always outwork them.
Yep.
You can control that. That's a common thread from successful people I've seen, is that they're always willing to put in the work.
I agree with that 100%. At different times, I've had small laboratories, large laboratories. I've had times when I've been surrounded by people that were smarter than me. Other times where I'm doing the bulk of the mental work. But it's been very rare, I think, that I've had a lab where everybody in the lab is working harder than me. That is also infectious. If I'm working hard, they tend to step up and work hard as well.
Yeah, everything rises and falls on leadership. It's so true. You set the tone. I want to drill in on this idea of mentorship, because based on my personal experience and observing your past students who are now in leadership roles in PSA and in the broader poultry community, you've obviously been very effective as a mentor to students. Talk to us about your approach to mentorship and what makes you effective in that space. The proof's in the pudding. You got a lot of good people out there that you have pollinated our industry with. How did that come about, and what advice do you have?
Some things that come into my mind. One, time. You've got to make time available for the people in your group. You have to be available. I have weekly lab meetings, and then I have weekly one-on-one meetings with everyone in my lab. I think that's critical. Another thing that I keep in mind is that everybody's an individual. Everyone is different. Everyone has their own personality, their own strengths, their own weaknesses. So you have to be adaptable to the personalities of the people that are in your group. You have to be able to mentor them as an individual rather than trying to put all the round pegs into the square holes, or vice versa. Another aspect of it is, yeah, I might be their boss, but I'm also their friend, right? Within limits. When you're first starting out in an academic position with your research lab, you are the most highly trained staff member in that group. And I see new assistant professors sitting in their office and expecting, their new students, new technicians, whoever, to be as productive as they were. And it's just not going to happen. So I tell everybody who's just starting out, you need to get in the lab yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Side by side, working with students, teaching them techniques. And during that time, a lot of mentoring can actually happen. You're having casual conversations. And I still get in the lab. I was just in the lab yesterday. I am not a young chicken, and I still go in the lab. I still love it.
I'm smiling as you're telling that story, because when we had Paul Siegel on the program, he's 93 years old. The day we interviewed him, he was out in the barn with graduate students for a few hours working with chickens and students. Exactly what you're saying. You lead from the front. I want to think about the global nature of poultry science for a minute, because you have a really broad global perspective on our scientific community. How do you see our discipline evolving globally in that regard, from the flow of science that's coming across your desk as a journal editor from all over the planet, to the work that you and I and the committee members are doing to build this conference in the Pacific Rim region? What's your perspective on the state of the world, shall we say, with regard to poultry science as a discipline?
I think it's very easy for anyone, any individual, any group of people to become geocentric. During much of my career, if we're thinking of the broiler industry, we're looking at Cobb and Ross, right? I mean, we're looking at two major breeding companies, and certainly there are others. But they all stem from the Western breeds, and we do things in North America a certain way. We have tunnel ventilated houses and swamp coolers on the side. We run a corn and soybean diet, all of these things. And it's very easy to think that that is the way to raise chickens, that that is the best way to raise chickens, which is really geocentric. Certainly in Europe, they don't run corn and soybean, they run a wheat-based diet. And it gets even more diverse and you get into other areas. If we look at poultry consumption as a whole and poultry science as a whole, the majority of poultry meat consumed in the world is not from Western genetic chickens. I would venture to say that half the world's population really doesn't even like Western chicken meat. They like slow-growing chicken, indigenous breeds. It's not like we're going to go back in time and take over, but I think in terms of evolving, poultry science evolving, those countries are developing. They have a lot of money, and they're putting a lot of money into research, agricultural research. I think poultry science as a field, a discipline, if you will, is going to evolve to see that. We're going to see a lot more science on what we would call non-standard or smallholder farms, minor breeds, different feed ingredients that are available in different countries that we just don't use in the United States. And we're seeing that already, but I think that trend is going to continue. I think we're going to see much less of a one shoe fits all approach and much more of a regional, country by country or district by district, not only approach to raising birds, but also of the science of the birds that they raise in those regions.
Right. This is probably a good time for me to plug the fact that we're right at a month out from the abstract submission deadline for the inaugural PSA Pacific Rim Scientific Conference. So I would encourage listeners to get involved and take part in some of those kind of discussions that you're describing. That'll be this October in Macau, and you can find information on abstract submission at poultryscience.org. Just click on the meetings and events tab. Tom, I want to get back into your research for a moment and work that you've done as a poultry scientist back in your field of expertise. You helped sequence half the chicken genome, which as a wannabe nerd, that kind of just blows my mind that, I'm friends with a guy that sequenced half the chicken genome. That's cool. How did that work come together? And what did that advancement mean for the field? How did it change the field once we had that genome in hand?
Point of clarification first. We were not involved in sequencing of the genome, but what we did is we identified and sequenced half of all of the known cDNAs, if you will, and that gets into jargon, but basically it's the gene products. We identified and sequenced more than half of all of the gene products from the genome. That was done in collaboration with a longtime collaborator of mine, Larry Cogburn at the University of Delaware. Really, our two laboratories in the end sequenced about 14,000 genes, if you will, which is more than half of the genes in the genome. How did that benefit poultry science? Those sequences were all deposited into a public database, and the group at NCBI at the NIH, which is involved in assembling and annotating the genomes, took all of our sequences and used them to identify the location of the genes in the chicken genome once it was sequenced. If you go into those databases and you click on a gene, more than 50% are going to be Larry Cogburn and Tom Porter. That really changed the field in the sense that it helped them assemble the chicken genome faster. It truly helped them annotate the chicken genome faster. Now we're on 6th or 7th assembly of it. We have multiple chicken genomes. And the chicken genome was used as a basis for assembling all of the other avian genomes. So it really had a broad-reaching effect. How it came together? I didn't start that project thinking I wanted to identify more than half of all the genes in the chicken genome. We were interested in identifying what genes are regulating growth hormone, and that's how I got into it. I focused on the neuroendocrine system, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland. We threw in the testes, the ovaries, the oviduct, and I sort of took over that half of it. I turned my lab into a little factory, and we cranked out more than 1/4 of all the genes in the chicken genome in 6 months.
That's amazing.
So that was amazing. But again, serendipity. I didn't set out to do that. I set out to identify the genes that were regulating growth hormone. That was just a tool that I wanted to use to do that. And we're still using that.
You talk about that, you wanted to use it as a tool, X to accomplish Y kind of thing. I'm struck again that, we talked about adaptation, flexibility as being a key trait for success, but that innate curiosity, I suppose you don't become a scientist if you're not curious about things, but I'm curious. There you go. I didn't even intend to phrase that question that way, but I'm curious your thoughts on the importance of that innate curiosity as maybe part of the recipe to Tom Porter's success, or do you see that in your graduate students, the ones who go on to be effective researchers? Is that just sort of table stakes as part of the recipe?
Yeah, and again, everybody has their own personality. Everyone has their own even career goals. But I think the ones who move on most successfully are the ones who ask questions and think about questions. And sometimes those questions are obvious, and other times you're in a seminar somewhere, in a symposium, and you might think, I wonder if the pituitary gland is involved in that. I go back to the genome work that we continue to do. I set out on that project with one question in mind: is how is growth hormone regulated? Within 2 years, we were using those same tools that we developed to look at effects of fasting and feeding, looking at appetite, feed intake regulation in chickens, looking at heat stress in chickens. We've done a lot of work with those tools. And then when more advanced tools were developed, not by us, but by others, like RNA sequencing, single cell RNA sequencing, we've adopted those techniques and are applying them to various questions. Curiosity is a great thing, but like I mentioned, I have more ideas drinking coffee in the morning than in any other time. And people that operate that way, where they're always asking questions, always thinking about things, have a leg up on others.
I guess successfully navigated the transition from journalism to working for a bunch of scientists. There's two groups of people that inherently ask a lot of questions. So, Dr. Porter, as we wrap up our time together, and this has been a personal treat for me, I have a question that I ask pretty regularly on the podcast. So if you have one misconception or misperception about poultry science or the poultry industry generally that you wish more people understood, what would that be?
I think in an era where the public, at least the Western public, putting a lot of emphasis on animal welfare, animal well-being, which is important. I think we can't lose sight of the fact that the poultry industry is feeding the world. It's going to be more and more important in future years, and that's going to take scientific research to improve poultry production. If the misconception is that we are abusing these birds and so forth, I think the fact of it is that whether it's in the industry or in the laboratory, I think we're doing quite a good job taking care of the birds.
Well said. And my observation is that everybody I've ever met who works in this industry usually got into working in some form of animal science or animal care, animal husbandry, because they genuinely love animals. It's one of the prerequisites, if you will, is that you actually like the birds. And that's a well said and a good place to end it. Dr. Tom Porter, who is, I say, a fellow of the Poultry Science Association and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, one of the highest honors that you can earn and bestowed upon you as a scientist. So thanks, Tom, for sharing your perspective, your advice, your wisdom. Friends, I would encourage you, if you've missed any of our recent episodes of Unplugged, to go back and listen. They're all available to you at our website, poultryscience.org, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you've got suggestions for a future topic or a guest you think would be great, drop us a note via our social media channels and engage with us. We'd love to feature something that's pertinent to your mind. I alluded earlier to the fact that we're a month out from the abstract submission deadline for our inaugural PSA Pacific Rim Scientific Conference. Registration is now open. You can find that at poultryscience.org. Just click on the Meetings and Events tab, scroll down to PSA Pacific Rim Scientific Conference this October in Macau. Submit your abstract, come participate, learn about what's happening in the global field of poultry science. If you enjoyed today's conversation, give us a rating wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. We'll be back next week with another in-depth conversation with a leader in poultry science, and look forward to seeing you then. Until next time, for the Poultry Science Association, I'm Andy Vance.